The following is a pre-recorded copy of the May 8th Planning Commission presentation on off-street parking. In 2022, City staff identified the need to update certain sections of the off-street parking code in the zoning chapter of the City Code. These amendments included parking setbacks, additional electric vehicle requirements, revising off-street parking minimums, and also updating land use description consistency within those parking minimums. Multiple meetings have been held previously by the Planning Commission in discussion of these items, and this is considered the final and formal public hearing of the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission had pulled from a number of sources in their review of off-street parking. Firstly, national and academic sources were used to establish a baseline knowledge of off-street parking and how it's managed nationally. Secondarily, we did look at some comparison communities within the metro. All of communities had a suburban profile, and in the case of Plymouth and Maple Grove, both communities had a high reliance on vehicle trips for transportation and low access to high-frequency transit. And then in the case of St. Louis Park, an existing electric vehicle code regarding charging stations was used as a base point for the city of Golden Valley. Finally, staff did do an analysis of existing land uses and parking requirements, as well as a review of overall parking within the city. As part of that overall analysis of parking, staff found that there were 480 acres currently of surface parking lots within the city of Golden Valley. This does not include residential driveways. There are 10 above ground parking structures as well as 13 underground parking structures. The ordinance under discussion tonight would include a number of miscellaneous code updates. Firstly, the city is looking to revise landscape requirements to further emphasize green space and native vegetated plantings over other screening types or hardscape. Secondarily, we are updating the setback requirements for the R3 and R4 zoning districts to match the structure setbacks in those districts. Thirdly, we are looking at allowing internal driveways between private properties with some restrictions on that allowance in order to maintain them in the future. And then finally, we are revising some of the information and requirements for permeable pavers in order to ensure that they function as advertised and do not contribute to impervious surface. A major addition to the off-street parking code is new requirements around electric vehicle charging stations. Moving forward, new or reconstructed parking lots over a certain size would be required to provide electric vehicle charging stations at either a level 2 or level 3 level of charge. This requirement would be based and scaled off of the size of the surface parking lot, in which a larger lot would require more electric vehicle charging stations and a smaller lot would require less. In this case, staff is encouraging the use of electric vehicle charging stations within structured parking, but this is not currently required in the proposed code. This certainly could be changed in the future if the Minnesota Building Code is updated. Another significant change is in regards to the minimum required parking. Minimum required parking is determined mostly by the land use present on a site and the size of the building itself for which a gross floor area is taken. Initially, staff was interested in reducing the minimum requirements for a number of different uses in order to reduce the amount of hardcover throughout the city. However, what was found is that without alternate transit options such as buses, light rail, or other options, these minimums can really only be reduced to a practical level where they are still providing enough parking for vehicles. Certain uses have had their minimums reduced where they were already overly protective. However, what staff found was that establishing an upper limit or a maximum may be another option to reduce impervious surface overall. The minimum and maximum parking is likely the most direct way for city to start reducing hardcover associated with surface parking. The other portion of this was just to reorganize and make more clear the types of uses in the required parking table. A point of discussion at its most recent meeting of the Planning Commission were the requirements for Class 2 fast food restaurants and their parking requirements. Currently, we require 1 space per 40 square feet of gross floor area. The proposal by staff was for 1 space per 75 square feet of gross floor area. There was questions of whether that amount was too significant of a reduction. In the table below, you can see on the left side the existing conditions for a number of existing businesses within the city: Taco Bell, Burger King, McDonald's, etc. It also provides an estimated square footage of those businesses and the current parking provided, as well as what that ratio would be if you took the parking spaces per the square footage of the building. Notably, in almost all cases, we are actually above that 1 per 40 gross floor area currently required, although some uses, notably the Taco Bell and Dairy Queen, are close to that amount. The middle column in gray provides the parking that would be required at a 1 per 40 rate. As we can see, in all cases, it does increase the amount of parking over what is provided today. And then to the right, and to the revised options, you can see parking required at 1 per 50 square feet, as well as 1 per 75 square feet. And then in the final column, the difference in parking of the existing, what is provided, versus what would be required at a 1 per 75 square foot requirement. In staff's opinion, these numbers mostly check out. In only a couple of cases do we have more parking being added at that 1 per 75. In almost all cases, we are actually reducing the amount of spaces being provided, and otherwise find it adequate given the existing current trends of parking with fast food restaurants. Another consideration at our last meeting were the limits placed on maximum parking required. Staff had suggested that a maximum cap of 10% over the minimum required for all commercial, industrial, and institutional uses be implemented. These tables seek to provide a bit of background on what that would look like in a practical application with a number of different types of land uses such as office, retail stores, manufacturing, and restaurants, among others. On the left side of the top table, you can see the land use itself, as well as the estimated square footage, and then the minimum parking ratio provided per square foot. When we take that use square footage and divide it by that minimum ratio, we then have the minimum parking requirements column, as well as to the right what would be required at a maximum of 10% and a maximum of 20%. If we see in the bottom table, again, we're taking the same types of uses. On the left side, those two columns are using the maximum of 10% parking count. We can see that in almost all cases, the number of parking spaces being allowed for above that minimum is usually less than 10 for smaller buildings. For the manufacturing and office uses, those are obviously larger in square footage, and so they allow for additional spaces above the minimum. We can also see here, using the standard stall size for the city, what that added hardcover would look like for those extra spaces being provided. And then finally, on the right side here, what a maximum of 20% would look like in terms of extra spaces being allowed, as well as that added hardcover. Here, obviously, because we're jumping from 10% to 20%, there are additional parking spaces being provided for, as well as additional hardcover. In terms of staff's thoughts on the topic of a maximum parking cap, one thought is that it does make sense to include more direction on how an administrative approval for exceeding maximum limits is decided. The current proposed language does allow for a use to exceed these maximum caps when there is approval by the city administrator, but providing more direction under what circumstances that would occur would be helpful for businesses. Secondly, we would look to see that maximums apply only to properties that meet their required parking, with a majority of it being surface parking. In the case that a property uses structured parking, that is already achieving some of the goals of the maximum parking limit by reducing overall hardscape. Thirdly, we could consider a 15% or a 20% cap if that 10% does seem too restrictive to start out at, and then potentially revise in the future, although staff is still comfortable at a 10% maximum. And then finally, we could also look at considering different caps by zoning district. So having a 10% cap per se for commercial and a 20% cap for institutional uses. Certainly, we could also look at the same concept of having different maximums per land use, although this would obviously have a bit more of a burden on staff time in terms of managing. To summarize the changes being proposed for the off-street parking chapter, overall, I think the main goal here was to revise that required minimum parking table to streamline it and make it more accessible to property owners, as well as reducing minimums where possible. I think that has been achieved here by the proposed code language. Secondly, parking maximums are an addition that might help to limit new parking lots from further increasing hardcover citywide. As noted, we already have 480 acres of surface parking. Establishing maximums sets an upper boundary to how large those can be in the future. And then finally, in terms of the electric vehicle requirements, In a lot of ways, requiring these charging stations throughout the city will help to achieve some of our environmental goals of the comprehensive plan, and certainly that chapter can be adapted and built upon in the future as technologies change.